Friends, colleagues, let us begin today by asking a simple but urgent question. Why are so many of the world's fault lines converging right now in the Middle East? Because behind the headlines, behind the sensationalist news flashes, lies a deeper truth about global capitalism, empire, and the unraveling of U.S. dominance. Israel's strategic panic today is not merely a headline or an exaggerated media frame. It is the genuine response of a state that senses the foundations of its security doctrine slipping beneath its feet. For decades, Israel's military, political, and economic position in the Middle East has been bolstered by a simple equation: the unwavering support of the United States, coupled with the fragmentation and relative weakness of its regional adversaries. That combination allowed Israel to maintain superiority, deter opposition, and operate with a confidence that few other states in such a turbulent region could claim. Yet the sudden, undeniable involvement of China and Russia in the Yemeni theater shakes that long-standing equilibrium. It sends a clear and unsettling message to Israel. The monopoly of power that safeguarded its interests is no longer guaranteed, and the protective shield of Washington's dominance is showing cracks. The panic stems from the fact that Israel, for the first time in decades, confronts adversaries who may not be standing alone. Yemen has often been portrayed in the West as a war-torn, impoverished nation incapable of shaping larger geopolitical currents. But with China and Russia quietly aligning themselves with Yemen, the perception shifts. The underdog suddenly gains weight. The smallest player on the board becomes a conduit for great power rivalry. And Israel knows well from history that when external powers support resistance movements in the region, the consequences can escalate quickly. This is not just about one country anymore. It is about the potential of an anti-Israel coalition that stretches beyond borders and taps into global currents of resistance against Western and USC-backed dominance. What makes the situation even more alarming for Israel is the unpredictability of the actors involved. Russia, cornered by Western sanctions and deeply entrenched in the Ukraine conflict, has every incentive to expand its influence in the Middle East, partly to outmaneuver NATO's encirclement and partly to show that it still holds leverage over global affairs. China, on the other hand, operates differently. It does not seek open confrontation, but works through economic corridors, infrastructure deals, and quiet but firm diplomatic backing. When these two powers converge, even loosely, in support of Yemen, it creates a dynamic that Israel cannot easily calculate or deter. Panic grows in Tel Aviv because the game board now has players with resources and patience far beyond the capacity of Israel's traditional adversaries. Here lies the deeper psychological hook. Israel has built its security doctrine on the premise that threats must be neutralized before they grow. Preemption has been the guiding principle. From strikes on neighboring states to covert operations abroad, Israel has acted with the knowledge that it could strike without facing a significant global backlash because the United States would provide cover. But with China and Russia hovering in the background, that calculus changes dramatically. Preemptive strikes on Yemen or other allies of these powers could suddenly carry unforeseen consequences. Could they provoke retaliatory measures? Could they escalate into broader conflicts? Could they jeopardize Israel's already fragile international standing? These are questions now weighing heavily on Israeli strategists. One must not overlook the symbolic impact as well. Israel, long seen as the dominant regional force, now faces the optics of being cornered. The narrative of strength and invulnerability, carefully cultivated both domestically and internationally, begins to erode the moment Israel appears rattled. Panic is contagious, It spreads from the security establishment to the political class and eventually to the public, shaping how Israelis view their future. Leaders know this, and they also know that perception itself can be as destabilizing as reality. Let us be clear, Israel's panic is not about Yemen alone. It is about the precedent this sets. If Yemen can secure backing from China and Russia, what prevents Lebanon's Hezbollah from doing the same? What prevents Syria from leveraging such alliances to resist Israeli air campaigns? What happens if Palestinian groups gain even indirect support through this expanding network? Each of these possibilities keeps Israeli strategists awake at night because they point to a future where Israel is no longer the unchallenged regional actor, but one embattled on multiple fronts, facing adversaries empowered by global giants. The irony, and here is the hook that must not be missed, is that Israel's panic mirrors a larger truth. Empires and their client states panic most when they sense the world they dominated is slipping away. Israel is not simply fearing Yemen. It is fearing the collapse of the entire system that gave it dominance. And as history has shown, panic in such moments often leads to rash decisions, miscalculations, and dangerous escalations. That is why this moment is so critical and why the world must pay close attention. Yemen's strategic position has always been underestimated by those who view it only through the lens of its poverty, its humanitarian crisis, and its internal divisions. Yet the reality is that Yemen sits on one of the most critical geopolitical choke points in the world, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. This narrow waterway connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and, by extension, links the Mediterranean through the Suez Canal to the vast Indian Ocean. Every year, billions of dollars worth of oil, gas, and global trade pass through this artery. To put it in perspective, nearly 10% of all international seaborne trade depends on this passage. Whoever exerts influence over Yemen inevitably holds leverage over global commerce itself. And this is precisely why the country, despite its battered condition, has become the focus of growing interest from global powers like China and Russia. The panic that Israel now feels is rooted in this very geography. For decades, Israel relied on the assumption that the Bab el-Mandeb would remain relatively stable, controlled indirectly by U.S. allies such as Saudi Arabia and Egypt, ensuring Israeli shipping routes and energy supplies remained secure. But the idea that Yemen, bolstered by Chinese and Russian support, could assert greater control over this choke point is nothing short of a nightmare for Tel Aviv. It raises the possibility that Israeli ships or Western energy shipments destined for Europe could suddenly find themselves vulnerable to disruption. That vulnerability translates into both military and economic insecurity, two dimensions Israel cannot afford to compromise. What makes Yemen's geography even more significant is its role in shaping global energy prices. Imagine, for a moment, a sudden closure or even sporadic disruption in the Bab el-Mandeb. Oil tankers would be forced to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to their journeys and billions in additional costs. That kind of delay would send shockwaves through international markets, spiking energy prices, destabilizing currencies, and adding fresh burdens to already fragile economies in Europe and beyond. Israel, positioned as a key Western ally, would inevitably feel the blowback. This is not simply a local issue. It is a trigger point for global economic instability. And herein lies the hook. Yemen, a country long dismissed as peripheral, now has the potential to hold the world's trade routes hostage, if only indirectly, through the patronage of China and Russia. The symbolic weight of this cannot be overstated. For decades, small nations in the global south were treated as chess pieces, their resources and locations manipulated by larger powers. Yemen's emergence as a strategic fulcrum challenges that narrative. By aligning even loosely with Beijing and Moscow, Yemen transforms from victim to player, from forgotten backwater to center stage in the contest for global influence. This transformation carries implications not just for Israel, but for the entire Western Bloc, which suddenly realizes that the supposed weak link in the chain has become a potential disruptor. For China, the attraction of Yemen's position is obvious. Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative envisions a vast network of trade routes spanning continents, and the Bab el-Mandeb is indispensable to that vision. Stability in Yemen, or at least influence over its strategic positioning, ensures China can safeguard its shipping lines from the Persian Gulf to Europe. For Russia, embroiled in its struggle against Western sanctions, Yemen offers another pressure point against the United States and its allies. Supporting Yemen is not merely about helping a beleaguered nation. It is about gaining leverage over a bottleneck of global commerce that could be used strategically in negotiations or conflicts. Israel, watching this unfold, recognizes the implications with unease. Its security has always relied on quick access to trade routes and secure passage for its imports and exports. The possibility that these could be threatened by Yemen, underpinned by great power backing, undermines the very foundations of Israel's long-term strategic planning. Here lies the deeper anxiety. If Israel can be pressured economically through trade routes, its vaunted military edge becomes less meaningful. An economy under stress cannot sustain prolonged military operations, nor can it maintain the technological advantage Israel has long cultivated. The real hook in this development is the irony. A country so often overlooked, reduced in Western narratives to images of famine and rubble, now has the power to induce panic in one of the region's most militarily advanced states. Geography, it turns out, can matter more than weaponry, and location can sometimes outweigh size or wealth. Yemen's position gives it a bargaining chip of immense value. And when amplified by Chinese and Russian involvement, that chip becomes a potential game changer in the Middle East. Yemen's strategic location thus forces a broader recognition in an era of shifting power balances. Even the smallest states, if positioned correctly, can tilt the global chessboard. Israel's alarm is not exaggerated. It is the acknowledgement of a reality in which Yemen is no longer just a battlefield of internal strife, but a pivotal player in the reconfiguration of global power. And as history repeatedly shows, when choke points become contested, empires feel the tremors. First, the notion of a multipolar power shift is no longer a theoretical debate among academics or a distant possibility whispered in policy circles. It is unfolding in real time, and nowhere is it more visible than in the Middle East. For decades, the region has been shaped by the dominance of one empire, the United States. From military bases to diplomatic leverage, from control over oil markets to vetoes in the United Nations, Washington played the role of gatekeeper, deciding who thrived and who suffered. Israel, positioned as America's closest ally in the region, reaped enormous benefits from this monopoly of power. But what we are seeing now is the unraveling of that system. China and Russia's growing involvement in Yemen is not an isolated incident. It is a signpost of a larger global transition. And this shift is creating precisely the kind of anxiety and panic that is surfacing in Tel Aviv. Multipolarity is at its core about choice. Where once smaller nations had to align themselves with Washington or face isolation, they now see alternatives emerging. Beijing offers loans, trade, and infrastructure without the political strings that often come attached to Western aid. Moscow offers military support and diplomatic cover in forums where the West once held sway. Together, they provide an escape hatch for nations long squeezed by the U.S.-dominated system. That is why Yemen's alignment with these rising powers matters so much. It illustrates that even a nation battered by war can find new patrons in a changing world order. For Israel, the implications of this are profound. Its strategy has always relied on the premise that U.S. dominance was permanent. This gave Israel the luxury of acting aggressively in the region while assuming no serious global counterforce would challenge it. But multipolarity introduces precisely that counterforce. Imagine Israel launching a strike against Yemen, Hezbollah, or even Iran. In the past, global condemnation would be symbolic at best. Today, China and Russia could respond with economic measures, military aid to Israel's adversaries, or diplomatic blockades that significantly constrain Israeli freedom of action. The very predictability of U.S. protection is now clouded with uncertainty, and uncertainty breeds fear. The hook here is that multipolarity is not just an abstract geopolitical idea, it touches daily life. Oil prices, food security, shipping lanes, and currency stability all become more volatile when multiple powers contest the same ground. For Western consumers, this may appear as rising costs at the gas pump or inflation in grocery stores. For Israel, it could manifest as a sudden vulnerability in trade routes or an inability to secure international backing in moments of conflict. The shift is not simply military, it is structural, weaving itself into the very fabric of global capitalism. Another layer of this shift lies in perception. The United States, once seen as the sole guarantor of order, now finds itself stretched thin by commitments in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. China and Russia capitalize on this overstretch, presenting themselves as reliable partners to nations tired of Western dominance. This perception matters as much as material power because in international politics, belief shapes behavior. If states believe Washington is weaker, they act with more independence. If they see Beijing or Moscow as rising, they lean in that direction. Multipolarity, in other words, is not only about tanks and trade, it is about the stories nations tell themselves about who is in charge. Israel is uniquely sensitive to these shifts because its survival strategy has always been tied to alliances with global hegemons. During the Cold War, it aligned with the United States to counter Soviet-backed Arab states. In the unipolar moment after the Cold War, it enjoyed unprecedented freedom of action, knowing no rival great power would intervene. But that moment is gone. Multipolarity means Israel must now consider the reactions of multiple capitals, Washington, Moscow, Beijing, before making its moves. This loss of unilateral freedom is deeply unsettling for a state built on military preemption and rapid response. The irony, and this is the hook that should not be missed, is that multipolarity is often fueled by the very excesses of the unipolar era. The United States' overreach in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere created space for new powers to step in. Its reliance on sanctions pushed countries like Russia, Iran, and China to deepen ties with each other, forging a web of relationships designed to bypass Western control. Now, Israel is facing the blowback of this system. Its closest allies' mistakes have produced the conditions for a world where it is no longer untouchable. In the coming years, the reality of multipolarity will only intensify. Regional powers like Turkey, Iran, and even Saudi Arabia are already hedging their bets, engaging not just with Washington, but with Beijing and Moscow as well. Israel, by contrast, is tightly bound to the U.S., making it far more vulnerable to the downsides of America's decline. The panic we see today is, in many ways, a preview of the crisis Israel will face in the future as multipolarity reshapes every dimension of global politics. What was once a one-way street of U.S. dominance has become a crowded intersection of competing powers, and in that intersection, even the strongest can feel exposed. The economic domino effect that arises from the shifting dynamics in Yemen is not just a local or regional concern, it has the potential to rattle the global economy in ways that few nations are prepared to handle. At the center of this is the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, where a disruption in shipping would immediately translate into higher transportation costs, longer delivery times, and an increase in energy prices worldwide. Israel's panic is fueled by the recognition that its own economic stability, tied deeply to global markets, could be undermined by events it cannot fully control. In a world already strained by inflation, supply chain breakdowns, and geopolitical tension, the prospect of another shock to oil and trade flows is a nightmare scenario for both Israel and its Western allies. Consider for a moment what happens when even a single choke point in global trade becomes contested. The Suez Canal blockage in 2021, caused by one stranded container ship, cost the global economy billions of dollars in a matter of days. Now imagine a similar disruption, not accidental but deliberate, stemming from instability in Yemen or from a coalition emboldened by Chinese and Russian support. Oil tankers forced to reroute around Africa would add weeks to delivery schedules, raising costs that ripple across every industry. These costs would not be absorbed quietly. They would be passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices for gasoline, food, and manufactured goods. The ripple quickly becomes a wave, touching households from Cairo to Berlin, from Tel Aviv to New York. Israel, despite its advanced technology sector and relatively diversified economy, is not insulated from these shocks. It relies heavily on secure trade routes for imports of energy, raw materials, and consumer goods. If shipping lanes become insecure or prohibitively expensive, Israel would face shortages, inflation, and a weakened ability to sustain its economic growth. Panic grows not only from the military threat posed by Yemen's location, but from the economic instability that would follow. Israel's leaders understand that a fragile economy cannot fund a strong military indefinitely, and this link between economics and security is precisely why Yemen's potential influence is so alarming. What makes the economic domino effect even more dangerous is its unpredictability. Markets operate as much on perception as on reality. If traders and investors believe that the Red Sea is unsafe, insurance premiums for shipping rise overnight even before a single ship is attacked. That increase alone can drive up global prices. Similarly, speculators on energy markets often react to the fear of disruption rather than the disruption itself, leading to volatility that can destabilize entire economies. Israel knows that in such an environment, panic itself becomes a weapon. The fear of instability can achieve what actual military strikes cannot: economic paralysis on a global scale. The hook that cannot be ignored is the broader political consequence of such an economic chain reaction. Europe, already under strain from the war in Ukraine and dependent on energy imports, would find itself in crisis if Red Sea trade routes were destabilized. Rising costs could inflame domestic politics, strengthen far-right movements, and weaken support for continued alignment with U.S. and Israeli policies. The United States, facing its own inflationary pressures and a divided domestic landscape, would struggle to manage the fallout of yet another global economic shock. In this scenario, Israel does not simply face regional isolation. It risks becoming the catalyst for broader fractures within the very alliances it depends on for survival. The economic domino effect also extends to developing nations. Many rely on affordable grain shipments passing through the Red Sea from suppliers in Eastern Europe, Russia, and beyond. Disruptions there would trigger food price hikes in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, fueling unrest and instability. Israel understands that widespread regional instability rarely works in its favor. A hungrier, angrier, and more desperate population across its borders is not a buffer, it is a spark waiting to ignite. The economic instability generated by Yemen's strategic leverage could thus feed into the very resistance movements that challenge Israel militarily. This is why the panic feels so urgent. The threat is not simply about missiles, drones, or naval skirmishes in the Red Sea. It is about the chain reaction those events unleash in the interconnected web of global capitalism. A strike in Yemen can raise fuel prices in Paris, disrupt supply chains in Shanghai, and push inflation higher in Tel Aviv all at once. The global system is too tightly linked to isolate such shocks, and that interdependence becomes a weapon in the hands of those willing to exploit it. Israel then is caught in a paradox. Its military power cannot solve the economic vulnerabilities that multipolarity exposes. It can strike enemies, but it cannot bomb away insurance premiums, market speculation, or consumer panic. The realization that its strength has limits in the face of global economic forces is what drives its current unease. And here lies the sharpest hook. The battlefield of the future may not be defined only by rockets and tanks, but by the cascading effects of disrupted trade, destabilized markets, and frightened populations. Yemen's position at the heart of this system gives it an influence far greater than its size would suggest. And it is precisely that leverage amplified by China and Russia that makes Israel tremble. The regional ripple impact of Yemen's growing strength, backed by China and Russia, is what keeps Israeli strategists awake at night. The Middle East is a region where symbols of resistance travel faster than weapons, and the sight of Yemen asserting itself against U.S. allies and Israel carries enormous psychological weight. If a country long portrayed as impoverished and devastated can leverage its geography and global alliances to resist, then others across the region will inevitably begin to ask, why not us? This is the real danger for Israel, not just the direct threat Yemen poses, but the inspiration it provides to others who have lived under Israeli dominance for decades. Consider Hezbollah in Lebanon. Already armed with an extensive missile arsenal and hardened by years of conflict with Israel, Hezbollah operates with a keen awareness of regional momentum. If Yemen can draw Chinese and Russian backing, even in limited forms of economic, diplomatic, or military support, Hezbollah may feel emboldened to test Israel's red lines more aggressively. Tel Aviv knows that a two-front or even three-front confrontation, Lebanon in the north, Gaza in the south, and Yemen disrupting maritime routes, would stretch its military resources thin. The ripple impact lies not in Yemen alone, but in the chain reaction its example sets off across the region. Syria, too, enters this calculus. After years of war and devastation, Syria remains heavily reliant on Russian support. If Moscow begins deepening its engagement in Yemen, it signals to Damascus that Russia is not only committed to preserving Syria's government, but also to expanding its regional footprint. That confidence could embolden Syria to push back harder against Israeli airstrikes on its territory, altering the balance of deterrence that Israel has long enjoyed. The regional ripple here is subtle but significant. Every small act of resistance begins to feel less isolated and more connected to a broader front supported by powerful patrons. Palestinian groups are perhaps the most sensitive to these shifts. For decades, Palestinians have struggled largely alone against Israeli occupation with little more than rhetorical backing from regional allies. The entry of China and Russia into the Yemeni theater carries a symbolic resonance. The great powers are no longer automatically aligned with Israel and the United States. Even a hint of diplomatic recognition, economic aid, or covert support from these powers could give Palestinian resistance movements a renewed sense of legitimacy and momentum. The hook here is undeniable. If the weakest in the region can claim powerful allies, what excuse remains for others not to act? The ripple impact also stretches into the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, once confident in their ability to dominate Yemen militarily, have already been humbled by years of costly conflict that yielded little success. If Yemen now finds itself backed by Russia and China, the credibility of Gulf monarchies takes another hit. That instability undermines their role as reliable partners for Israel in the normalization deals promoted under the Abraham Accords. What Tel Aviv hoped would be a new era of cooperation with Arab states could instead unravel as those same states hedge their bets by reaching out to Beijing and Moscow. The regional alliances Israel worked so hard to cultivate begin to look fragile under the pressure of multipolarity. There is also the matter of public perception. Across the Arab and Muslim world, images of Yemen defying Western-backed powers resonate deeply. The narrative of resistance, long central to regional politics, gains renewed vitality when supported by global heavyweights. Populations frustrated with their own government's compromises or failures look to Yemen as a symbol of resilience. That popular sentiment, in turn, pressures governments in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and beyond to distance themselves from Israel, even if reluctantly. The ripple effect operates not only through governments, but through the street, and history shows that when public anger builds, leaders are forced to adapt. Israel's panic is sharpened by the recognition that it cannot control this domino effect. Military superiority cannot erase the symbolic power of a smaller nation standing tall against larger foes. Economic strength cannot silence the images and stories that travel across borders and inspire new forms of resistance. The ripple impact is intangible yet profound, and it grows with each new alliance or gesture of support Yemen receives from China and Russia. The irony, and here lies the hook, is that Israel's dominance has always depended on preventing exactly this kind of regional contagion. Its strategy relied on keeping adversaries divided, isolated, and weakened. But the moment one of them, even Yemen, begins to break free of that isolation, the others begin to imagine alternatives. The chain reaction cannot easily be stopped once it begins. Just as the Arab Spring spread across borders in 2011, the image of Yemen as a defiant, supported actor could ignite a similar wave of confidence against Israeli and Western dominance. This is why the regional ripple effect is far more dangerous than any single battlefield outcome. Yemen's resilience does not remain within its borders. It radiates outward, reshaping perceptions, altering alliances, and emboldening resistance. For Israel, the challenge is not just facing one adversary, but confronting the possibility of many, coordinated not formally, but inspired collectively. That possibility turns panic into policy, forcing Tel Aviv to prepare for a future where the very balance of power in the Middle East is shifting beneath its feet. The regional ripple impact of Yemen's growing strength, backed by China and Russia, is what keeps Israeli strategists awake at night. The Middle East is a region where symbols of resistance travel faster than weapons, and the sight of Yemen asserting itself against U.S. allies in Israel carries enormous psychological weight. If a country long portrayed as impoverished and devastated can leverage its geography and global alliances to resist, then others across the region will inevitably begin to ask, why not us? This is the real danger for Israel, not just the direct threat Yemen poses, but the inspiration it provides to others who have lived under Israeli dominance for decades. Consider Hezbollah in Lebanon, already armed with an extensive missile arsenal and hardened by years of conflict with Israel. Hezbollah operates with a keen awareness of regional momentum. If Yemen can draw Chinese and Russian backing, even in limited forms of economic, diplomatic, or military support, Hezbollah may feel emboldened to test Israel's red lines more aggressively. Tel Aviv knows that a two-front or even three-front confrontation, Lebanon in the north, Gaza in the south, and Yemen disrupting maritime routes, would stretch its military resources thin. The ripple impact lies not in Yemen alone, but in the chain reaction its example sets off across the region. Syria, too, enters this calculus. After years of war and devastation, Syria remains heavily reliant on Russian support. If Moscow begins deepening its engagement in Yemen, it signals to Damascus that Russia is not only committed to preserving Syria's government, but also to expanding its regional footprint. That confidence could embolden Syria to push back harder against Israeli airstrikes on its territory, altering the balance of deterrence that Israel has long enjoyed. The regional ripple here is subtle but significant. Every small act of resistance begins to feel less isolated and more connected to a broader front supported by powerful patrons. Palestinian groups are perhaps the most sensitive to these shifts. For decades, Palestinians have struggled largely alone against Israeli occupation, with little more than rhetorical backing from regional allies. The entry of China and Russia into the Yemeni theater carries a symbolic resonance. The great powers are no longer automatically aligned with Israel and the United States. Even a hint of diplomatic recognition, economic aid, or covert support from these powers could give Palestinian resistance movements a renewed sense of legitimacy and momentum. The hook here is undeniable. If the weakest in the region can claim powerful allies, what excuse remains for others not to act? The ripple impact also stretches into the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, once confident in their ability to dominate Yemen militarily, have already been humbled by years of costly conflict that yielded little success. If Yemen now finds itself backed by Russia and China, the credibility of Gulf monarchies takes another hit. That instability undermines their role as reliable partners for Israel in the normalization deals promoted under the Abraham Accords. What Tel Aviv hoped would be a new era of cooperation with Arab states could instead unravel, as those same states hedge their bets by reaching out to Beijing and Moscow. The regional alliances Israel worked so hard to cultivate begin to look fragile under the pressure of multipolarity. There is also the matter of public perception. Across the Arab and Muslim world, images of Yemen defying Western-backed powers resonate deeply. The narrative of resistance, long central to regional politics, gains renewed vitality when supported by global heavyweights. Populations frustrated with their own governments, compromises, or failures look to Yemen as a symbol of resilience. That popular sentiment, in turn, pressures governments in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and beyond to distance themselves from Israel, even if reluctantly. The ripple effect operates not only through governments, but through the street, and history shows that when public anger builds, leaders are forced to adapt. Israel's panic is sharpened by the recognition that it cannot control this domino effect. Military superiority cannot erase the symbolic power of a smaller nation standing tall against larger foes. Economic strength cannot silence the images and stories that travel across borders and inspire new forms of resistance. The ripple impact is intangible yet profound, and it grows with each new alliance or gesture of support Yemen receives from China and Russia. The irony, and here lies the hook, is that Israel's dominance has always depended on preventing exactly this kind of regional contagion. Its strategy relied on keeping adversaries divided, isolated, and weakened. But the moment one of them, even Yemen, begins to break free of that isolation, the others begin to imagine alternatives. The chain reaction cannot easily be stopped once it begins. Just as the Arab Spring spread across borders in 2011, the image of Yemen as a defiant, supported actor could ignite a similar wave of confidence against Israeli and Western dominance. This is why the regional ripple effect is far more dangerous than any single battlefield outcome. Yemen's resilience does not remain within its borders. It radiates outward, reshaping perceptions, altering alliances, and emboldening resistance. For Israel, the challenge is not just facing one adversary, but confronting the possibility of many, coordinated not formally, but inspired collectively. That possibility turns panic into policy, forcing Tel Aviv to prepare for a future where the very balance of power in the Middle East is shifting beneath its feet. The idea of empire in decline is not an abstraction. It is a pattern that history has repeated time and again. Israel's current panic over Yemen, magnified by the involvement of China and Russia, is best understood through this lens. For decades, Israel thrived under the umbrella of U.S. dominance, an era when Washington could dictate terms across the Middle East with little serious opposition. That dominance insulated Israel, allowing it to act with confidence that no regional adversary, however determined, could fundamentally alter the balance of power. Yet today, the unmistakable signs of U.S. decline are visible to all, and Israel, tethered so closely to American power, feels the tremors more acutely than most. When empires decline, their allies rarely feel secure. They feel exposed. That exposure explains the deep unease gripping Israeli leadership. Empires decline for many reasons, but one of the most consistent is overreach. The United States stretched itself across too many theaters, from Iraq to Afghanistan, from NATO expansion to the pivot to Asia, believing it could sustain a level of global dominance unmatched in history. But wars drained resources, economic crisis weakened confidence, and domestic polarization eroded the very foundation of U.S. stability. Into that vacuum stepped new powers, eager to claim space that Washington once monopolized. China builds trade corridors and invests across the global south. Russia, despite sanctions and isolation, finds ways to assert its military and diplomatic relevance. This is not the product of chance, but the natural process of redistribution that occurs when one empire falters and others rise. Israel finds itself caught in the middle of that process, no longer shielded by a singular hegemon, but exposed to a world of multiple poles of power. The panic Israel exhibits is in many ways a mirror of what the United States itself is experiencing. Both sense the erosion of their dominance, but struggle to adapt to the reality of shared power. For Israel, the decline of American hegemony means its deterrence strategy is weakened. Where once it could act militarily without fear of global reprisal, now every strike carries the possibility of response from other great powers. The luxury of unilateralism fades, replaced by the necessity of caution. And for a state built on rapid preemptive strikes, that shift feels like suffocation. The hook that should not be missed here is that empires in decline often lash out most aggressively. History shows us that when Rome felt its grip slipping, it expanded its wars in desperation. When Britain faced decline after World War II, it clung to colonies until forced to retreat. When the United States senses its fading dominance, it escalates militarily, hoping to reassert what economics and politics can no longer guarantee. Israel, tied so closely to the American empire, risks repeating this pattern. Its panic may drive it toward more aggressive policies in Gaza, Lebanon, or even Iran, not because it strengthens its position, but because it fears showing weakness. That desperation can accelerate decline rather than prevent it. There is also a deeper psychological element. Decline is not only about material loss, but about identity. The United States has long seen itself as the indispensable nation, and Israel has framed itself as the indispensable ally in the Middle East. When those narratives begin to collapse, They create an existential anxiety that no military budget or diplomatic maneuver can easily soothe. Israel's panic is not simply about Yemen's position or Russia and China's involvement. It is about the crumbling story that Israel told itself about its invulnerability under U.S. protection. The unraveling of that story is as destabilizing as any missile or blockade. The economic dimension of decline compounds the problem as U.S. debt spirals and domestic priorities demand greater attention. The ability of Washington to funnel endless resources to Israel diminishes. Already, debates in American politics reveal cracks in the once unshakable bipartisan support for Tel Aviv. Younger generations in the U.S. are increasingly critical of Israeli policies, and global movements call for accountability. Israel, sensing the fragility of its position, recognizes that a decline in American support, even gradual, could leave it dangerously exposed. That realization magnifies the panic because it forces Israel to imagine a future where it must stand more alone than ever before. The irony, and here lies the hook, is that the very dominance Israel enjoyed for decades now works against it. Being so closely tied to the American empire means sharing its decline. Other regional actors, more flexible and less dependent, may adapt more easily to a multipolar world. But Israel, structurally reliant on U.S. protection, struggles to find alternatives. It is too deeply invested in a fading system to pivot quickly to the new one that is emerging. That lack of adaptability makes its panic not only understandable but predictable. What we are witnessing then is not just Israel reacting to Yemen, but Israel reacting to the slow but undeniable unraveling of the empire that guaranteed its supremacy. The regional shifts, the emboldening of resistance groups, the involvement of China and Russia. All of these are symptoms of a deeper reality, the decline of U.S. hegemony and the ripple effects that decline generates. Israel's fear is that in the next phase of history, it will no longer occupy the privileged position it once did, and that fear drives its policies, its rhetoric, and its escalating sense of urgency. The empire may not yet have fully collapsed, but its cracks are visible, and Israel is standing directly beneath them.